Good evening. Welcome to Aro Ling Cardiff's Monday Meditations, an evening of song, practice and teaching. And tonight Ngakma Nor'dzin will be teaching on the subject of the Four Noble Truths.
It's quite interesting looking at the Four Noble Truths, because I think it's a subject that probably many of us began with, that it might have even been the first teaching that we heard, and I think it's a subject that we think, oh, we know that it's like the basis of Buddhism and everybody knows about the Four Noble Truths, and maybe we don't ever think about them again, and so I found it quite interesting looking through some notes and reading some things about this in preparation for this topic. So I think in order to talk about the Four Noble Truths, we have to start with Shakyamuni Buddha, because Siddhartha Gautama was the person who gained realization, and these are his teachings, so I think it's only correct to start with him. He was a prince and he lived a life of luxury. He had everything in terms of what the world could offer that anybody could possibly want. So he had riches, he was also a very capable person, he excelled in everything that he was taught. He married, so he experienced being in love. He had good parents who cared about him. He had a child, so he experienced all the riches of life in a context of a very privileged and, one might say, perfect life, that he had all that could be desired from the ordinary world. He had money and wealth and power and influence, and also personal capacity as well. And yet, despite these privileges and this background from which he came, he was looking for something else. He had this experience of dissatisfaction, and so he gave up this life in the palace. He left his wife and child, and he followed the religion of the era, which was the Brahma religion, and he became a priest or a practitioner in that religion. And this was at that time was a religion that very much focused on renunciation and not indulging the flesh. And he, in the same way that he had lived as a prince in a very full sense of that, he'd completely embraced it and become the best at all that lifestyle could offer. He fully embraced the life of being a priest or a practitioner, a yogic practitioner. And you will no doubt have seen some quite startling images of statues of him when he has starved himself, he has taken the renunciate path to the point where he's on the point of dying of starvation. So this was not a person who didn't give things a go. He really saw things through to the full extent of the path. But he realized that the path of asceticism gave him no more satisfaction than the path that you could call hedonism. So neither extreme enabled him to experience realization and full satisfaction. And so he also gave up this ascetic path, and he started to live a more normal life and eat again, and he obviously continued to practice, but he didn't take it to that extreme of renunciation. And he continued to practice, and he gained realization through his own practice of meditation. Now, for a long time, he didn't teach, and those that could see that he had gained realization wanted him to teach, but he didn't teach for a long time. When I was thinking about this and why that must have been that he didn't teach immediately, the part of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came to mind, if you'll excuse the rather whimsical reference, where they've been waiting a very long time for deep thought to come up with the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And deep thought, this is the great computer, tells them, I have the answer. And they'll go, oh yes, yes, what is it, what is it? And he says, you're not going to like it. Well, I feel that it was probably a little bit like that for the Buddha, that he had this answer. He thought, they're not going to like it. How can I put this over to them in a way that they can actually embrace it? How can I transmit, how can I communicate what I have realized in language that they can understand, but also in language that will make them engage in practice? Because the danger was that they would adopt I can't think of the word, the style of his practice. So they'd go and sit under Bodhi trees, but they would miss the point, and so they'd be doing, they thought, what he was doing, and really they were just embracing him and what he was. Or alternatively, they would attempt to understand what he was teaching through their own training in logic and understanding the nature of reality, but they would also miss the point there because they'd been looking outside of themselves for the answer. So I think for me the message very much here is that what he had to communicate, and was quite difficult to communicate, was that you have to do this for yourself. You meditate because it is the only way to actually discover the realization that I have discovered. You don't meditate because of your respect and inspiration with me, although that may be a factor, or because you're thinking your way into sitting under a Bodhi tree is going to give you realization. So we can't grasp it through the intellect, and faith is not sufficient. The type of practice at that time was very based in ritual practice and believing in certain rituals and practices and in a theistic approach. And so I think we can tend to lose sight of how radical a change in approach this was at that time. And perhaps if, for those of us, I certainly came to Buddhism from a background of Christianity, and I think there was a point where I sort of went, wow, this is so different, and really had that moment of, yes, I really want to engage in this practice because it touches me at a level that I've never been touched before. But then there is this temptation to just go through the form of the practice, to chant the practice you've been given, and to just sit in wonder at the feet of the people who seem to understand it, but not really practice. So I think this was, for me, this feels why he didn't teach immediately, because he wasn't sure how to put it across, how to make people actually engage in practice. So this was the first teaching. The Four Noble Truths was the first teaching. In Tibetan it's Pagpe Denpa Ji. Ji means four. Now Pagpe means like the noble ones, and the noble ones are either those who have already gained realization or those who are firmly on the path to realization, so the people who are firmly engaged in practice. And Denpa means fact, truth, certainty, authenticity, genuine. So the Four Noble Truths are, another way that you could phrase this, are that they are the truths of the noble ones. They're the certainties that can be discovered through this path of the noble ones, the ones who actually engage in this path. So these cannot be certainties unless you're practicing. If you only engage with them at the level of trying to intellectualize about them, or through just trying to not practice but sort of go, oh wow, this person's so amazing, if I sit at their feet something will happen to me. You have to be a noble one. You have to actually get in there and engage in the practice. Another rather extraordinary thing about this teaching is the way that he presented it, because he also had to think about how can I present this in a style that they can actually communicate with, that they can latch on to in some way. And so he presented it in a style that would have been similar to the style that the teachings were presented in terms of Brahmaism. And that's why you may disagree, but I think it feels a bit clunky, this style of presentation. There's this, and then there's that, and then there's this, and then there's that. And I think that is not necessarily a way that we would present the teaching in a modern era, but this was very much the flavour of the way the teaching would have been presented at that time. And so there is this, and then there is that, and then there is this, and so you have to do that. And that is a style that they would have understood. So these four truths or facts of the noble ones, I will quickly run through the four and then look at them in more detail. So the first one is, in Sanskrit the word is dukkha, in Tibetan the word is dugnal, and this means suffering, dissatisfaction or frustration. And the second one is that this has a cause. So first you identify it, and then you understand that it has a cause. Then the third noble truth is that dissatisfaction can cease. Dissatisfaction can just stop arising. The cessation, you can stop it. And then the fourth noble truth is the path that enables you to stop the experience of frustration, dissatisfaction, suffering. So they come in these two pairs. The suffering, it has a cause. You can stop suffering, and this is how you do it. So I'm going to take the first two kind of together because they can be quite difficult to tease apart, which is is the truth of dissatisfaction and which is the cause of dissatisfaction. And I think in a modern setting, we don't actually need to go to the to worry too much about teasing those apart. What we need to understand is that the experience of dissatisfaction is a reality, is a fact, and it's personal. It's our own experience of dissatisfaction. It isn't that dissatisfaction is somehow built into the fabric of being alive. It's that dissatisfaction is built into the fabric of how we are alive, or how I am alive. It's personal. Dukkha is personal. And therefore, our practice, our examination to realize this fact of dissatisfaction has to be a very personal examination. We can't just look at other people and expect to really discover this as a useful truth that then becomes a basis to actually engage in practice. So seeing that there are people starving in the world, seeing that there are places where wars are happening, seeing that there are horrible diseases in the world that people suffer from, seeing that there is poverty, that there's unkindness, whilst those are all true, they are not necessarily going to make you practice in the same sense of urgency and immediacy than if you know your own experience of dissatisfaction like a continual itch that you just can't scratch, like having a plaster cast on and you've got an itch inside that plaster cast, and even though you've put a knitting needle down there, you just can't scratch it. So you have to feel this experience of dissatisfaction at that very personal level, as well as at the level of seeing what is happening with other people. So we spend our lives trying to avoid the experience of unhappiness or dissatisfaction or suffering. If we find we can't avoid it, then we'll attempt to endure it. So we'll find ways of putting up with it. But basically our ways of putting up with it still have at the back, in the background, that we'll eventually find a way of avoiding it. Or alternatively, if we have moments where we appear to be free of an experience of dissatisfaction or suffering or frustration, then we actually experience suffering in that, because our immediate reaction is, oh God, how am I going to keep this? How can I make this stay? We're immediately frightened that we're going to lose that experience of happiness. We're going to lose being free of that experience of dissatisfaction. So even when we are happy, there is a quality of dissatisfaction there, because we know it'll go, we know it'll change, we know it won't remain forever. So we're never free of this feeling of dissatisfaction. Now, something that is often misunderstood in terms of this experience of dissatisfaction is that there is something that is unsatisfactory. So this is splitting ourselves into subject and object. I experience dissatisfaction, so therefore there is an object that is creating that dissatisfaction. And this is a problem because it is, once again, it's removed it one level from being personal. We're not looking for it in ourselves anymore because we've decided there's an object that's the cause of it. So we might have a split of self and other. We see others suffering, but that doesn't touch us because it's them that's suffering, and we just hope it doesn't touch us. But then when we experience it, we blame it on something. So this is splitting it into subject and object. I'm experiencing dissatisfaction because of that, whatever that is. So there are usually two aspects that are given as the cause of the experience of dissatisfaction. And these in Sanskrit are klesha and karma. Klesha in Tibetan is nyongmong, and karma in Tibetan is le. Now, klesha is connected to the elements and distortion of our fundamental elemental nature, and it's connected to our emotions. It's connected to the way we react and respond, and perception and response, and the nature of those responses. So our confusion or distortion that arises through the experience of dissatisfaction, of frustration, these responses lay down patterns. They lay down patterns in the mind stream, and these patterns are the karma that we keep repeating, so that it feels like it's either automatic or it's normal, or it's karma that we feel we have no choice because it's just there. Now, I'm not going to talk about karma very much because karma was the topic that Ngakpa talked about last week. So we have Margaret here, who I don't think was here last week. Hello, Margaret, nice to see you. If you want to hear the teaching on karma that was given last week, please go to our YouTube channel, Aro Ling Cardiff YouTube channel, and you can hear that teaching there. So there is karma, and there is our response, our emotional response that creates karma. And these three things that I mentioned of trying to avoid the experience of dissatisfaction, enduring the experience of dissatisfaction, or if we're free of dissatisfaction for some period of time, grasping at it. These relate to the three root misconceptions, and in that order I gave them. This is aversion, ignorance or indifference, and attraction. Now, an example that is often given in the teachings about this is having been hit with an arrow. I think probably these days we'd say shot with a gun, but an arrow works just as well. So you imagine that you've got this arrow stuck in your shoulder because you've been shot. Well, the cure would be to take the arrow out. But somehow that is too direct and immediate, and we can't see it. It's so obvious that we can't see it. So we try to ignore that the arrow's there. We kind of get used to the pain and we don't notice the arrow. Maybe it's just a little stump of an arrow that's left there, or the bullet is hidden and there's not much sign that the bullet's there anymore. So we learn to endure it. Or perhaps we have to adjust our clothing. So we're making a dress or a jacket, and you have to make this neat little hole in it so that when you put it on, it goes round the arrow, so that it's accommodated in some way. And of course we've got to be careful that other people don't accidentally knock the arrow. So we have to continually protect ourselves because we're so sensitive, because we've got this wound. It makes us very sensitive and very touchy because we continually want to protect this wound. But the wound kind of also gives us something on which to focus. Who are we if we don't have an arrow in our shoulder? How would we exist if we hadn't got our wound? So our wound becomes this big reference point. The arrow in our shoulder becomes this big reference point. It gives us a reason to protect ourselves. It gives us a reason to feel sorry for ourselves. It gives us a reason to think that our suffering is much more real than anybody else's suffering, because look, I've got this arrow in my shoulder, you can see it, it's there, it hurts, you don't want to touch it. So pulling the arrow out, that would be the cure, can feel unattractive, strangely. We can feel that we won't want to do it. But these teachings, these 4 fundamental certainties, tell us if you just pull that darn thing out, then you'll be cured. That it is possible for that wound to heal. This is a fact. This is the truth. You can pull it out and immediately things will be different. But somehow that is too difficult for us. We're just too used to having that wound. We can't really believe it's that simple. And so the experience of realization is often said to be too close for us to be able to engage with. It's too subtle. And we looked at self and other, and we looked at subject and object. There's also existence and non-existence. If I am a person without the reference point of my wound, my arrow stuck in my shoulder, do I still exist? Do I have a definition anymore? What if I lose the definition of the person with the arrow in their shoulder? If I don't have the definition of being somebody who gets irritable in this situation, somebody who has this sort of personality that responds in that sort of way, somebody who is paranoid about certain things, somebody who worries about certain things, somebody who is rather territorial. I was very territorial the other day. Daniel was using my favourite wooden bowl for his dinner. And how dare you use my wooden bowl? That's my bowl. You're not supposed to use that one. You've got your own bowl. And it's just amusing to look at the way we do those things. So, do we exist if we haven't got that arrow anymore? If we haven't got that, how are we different to anybody else if if that isn't there making us special anymore, if it isn't there meaning that we have to protect ourselves anymore. Now, another aspect of existence and non-existence is I see that I am not completely disconnected from your pain. I actually can see that you've got an arrow in your shoulder as well. So the fact that I can see it means that it's part of me. That awareness is part of me. So the boundary between existence and non-existence starts to become a little bit blurred when I start to recognize that seeing you and seeing me is actually dependent on the connection between us that is to do with being the mind, is to do with being beings that communicate. So do I exist if you're not seeing me? Do I exist if you're not interacting with me? Do I exist if I'm not allowing the pain from the arrow in my shoulder to impact on me? These sort of questions will start to arise once we truly start to look at why we experience dissatisfaction, why we experience suffering, why do we have these emotional responses, and why do we allow these emotional responses to hurt other people? Why do I get irritable if a certain thing is happening in my life, and allow that irritation to spill out and affect another person? If I truly understood that the experience of pain is to do with my mind, and the experience of irritation is entirely my own, I cannot in any sense prove any intention from your side that you intended to irritate me. That is highly unlikely. And even if it is the truth, it's not useful. So if I take full responsibility for the irritation or the paranoia or the selfishness or whatever that emotion is, then the fact of the dissatisfaction becomes entirely personal again. I'm not splitting it into self, other, subject, object. Does it exist? Doesn't it exist? Now, the fourth way of looking at this is in terms of emptiness and form. Where is the form of my pain when I've let go of it? It becomes empty. If I actually succeed in removing the arrow, then the experience of pain is gone. The cause of the pain is gone. There is no longer any need to protect a wound that is no longer there. So if I allow my experience of you or anything external being the cause of my dissatisfaction, my experience of dissatisfaction, then that completely dissolves it. It dissolves into emptiness because I've removed the me that needs to protect myself, that is using that irritation as a protection for an illusory me. Now, in terms of the slogans, those of you who know me well on this screen will know that I'm never far away from a slogan of Chikaya Shidoji. In terms of the slogans, we regard everything that is external as dreamlike, and everything that is internal is illusory. And in terms of suffering or dissatisfaction, a dream-like circumstance cannot impact on reality. It cannot actually affect us. If we regard all external phenomena as dreamlike, then we know that ultimately a dream cannot affect our waking experience. So this means that we no longer need to protect ourselves from the dream's impact. And if we regard every reaction and response that arises in the mind as illusory, then I can let go of all the responses that would impact on you, would impact on circumstances, that would impact on external factors, because I recognize them as mind and therefore illusory. They arise and they dissolve. They have no permanent substance to them. So this is the cessation. This is how we identify the cause of the experience of our dissatisfaction, and this is how we engage the path in order to cease experiencing phenomena as unsatisfactory and responding as if that is reality. And this eightfold path, which I think Ngakpa will talk on next week, I will just enumerate the 8. Is that a question?
Yes.
I'm wondering whether the dissatisfaction from someone else's pain, from your sister's pain, the dissatisfaction when your dream is a nightmare, and you're looking at it going, I have to stop this. Where there's just, you're looking at this going, oh my gosh.
Okay, so this teaching does not deny the reality of there being real pain. This teaching is not saying bad things don't happen in the world. The reality of any suffering in our life is that it moves in and out of our present moment experience. And I think in terms of actual experience of suffering, it's allowing it to move in that way that is important. So, for example, the time of my father's death, but at that time I can remember that there was a great gathering of family and a gathering of people that I hadn't seen for a long time, and there were many joyful shared moments that were part of the whole scene around my father's death. Now, experiencing the joy of those moments isn't a bad thing because of the context. In fact, to deny the joy of those moments, even despite the context, that would be allowing it to be a definition. So when there is real pain happening in your life, real actual suffering, either of yourself or as somebody else, then it is completely natural to feel that very potently. But when moments of happiness arise, allow them to arise. Don't feel, I can't be happy because of this situation. And when the the acuteness of that pain has naturally dissolved. Allow it to dissolve. Don't hold on to it as something that has to be endured because it's part of your life at the moment. I hope that's a little bit of a satisfactory answer to your question. Great, thank you. Because in a sense, that wasn't really what Shakyamuni Buddha was addressing in this teaching. He wasn't actually addressing the great amount of suffering that there is in the real world. He was addressing that the mind can awaken. We can awaken and become realized beings. But in order to do that, we have to see that we're asleep. We have to see that we create our own distortion, that our experience of unsatisfactoriness, even when things are good, that we do that to ourselves. We can stop doing it to ourselves. It can cease. And that there is a path. There's a cause, there's a stopping, and there's a path. And the path, I'll quickly run through it if I can remember them, is the word right is used, but you can talk about what so it's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right vocation, right effort, right attention, and right presence. And those 8 factors become a path that lead to awakening, that lead to full realization and the experience of Shakyamuni Buddha.